Keren, it's great to have you on the show, and I know that you are a mine of information on all things to do with mushrooms and the natural world and its medicinal properties. Now, we're talking to you at your herbal dispensary, and it's autumn. What can we look for now? What are the main events in autumn where we are now in Scotland and across the Northern Hemisphere?
The main events in nature, what
Yeah.
we can forage and look for.
In nature, yes.
Yes, I was going to say the main events we could think about probably in terms of our health would be our immune systems, but I think that's been a challenge all year with that for us across the world. But in nature, what we look at in autumn is, well, certainly it's berry season, and it's that sort of real harvest season. So berries and mushrooms are the real things that we look for when we're out foraging in the autumn months. Interestingly, they both do actually cross over onto the immune system as well. But for me, as a forager, I'd say a hobby forager, I don't do it as part of this business, but I do it for myself, for pleasure, to spend a lot of time out in nature. It's the time to really go and harvest mushrooms. Now we're into October now, so we are coming towards the end of the sort of edible mushroom season as such. There are still a few nice mushrooms out there. At the weekend I was out and managed to find some mushrooms called hedgehogs, which are really quite nice to eat, and normally horrifies people when I say that I had hedgehogs for my tea last night. So hedgehogs are about. There's still some chanterelles and some winter chanterelles there. And one mushroom that I've seen a lot over the past couple of weeks when I've been out has been fly agaric, which is that wonderful, red mushroom with the white spots that we associate with folklore. The fly agaric that I have come across have been mainly growing around birch, and we're very lucky here in Scotland because of the number of birch trees that we have, and there are a number of mushrooms that are associated with them as well. So yeah, around birch forests, really good ancient woodlands, we tend to find quite a lot of our edibles and medicinal mushrooms actually, and birch is quite an interesting tree for those.
I was going to ask you about that, because not only are some of the mushrooms hugely beneficial in terms of medicine, which you know a lot about, but also birch trees themselves are incredible in terms of their health properties. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, absolutely. When I was studying herbal medicine, we primarily learnt about birch using the leaves medicinally. And the leaves do have some betulinic acid in them, but nowhere near as high a dosage as the actual bark on the tree. But they have some betulinic acid. They're incredibly cleansing and diuretic. So traditionally, we've used birch for treating joint problems, arthritis, gout. It's one of the herbs that I use when managing gout in herbal medicine clinic. And it works as a sort of cleanser for the kidneys. So it's very, very cleansing. Alkalining in the bloodstream as well, helps to flush toxins out the kidneys, gets rid of uric acid as well. So the real thing that I learned about birch was the leaves, but actually there's so much more to it than that. The actual bark itself is really, really high in a compound called betulinic acid, and it's very antiseptic. There's lots of scientific interest in it, and if you actually go away and do a bit of research online and Google betulinic acid, you'll find there's lots of different papers looking at its medicinal compounds. Its antibacterial effects are particularly interest to scientists because of antibiotic resistance that we have going on. And basically, bacteria that are becoming really resistant to antibiotics, they're quite clever. They make a sort of slimy biofilm, which they then hide underneath, and the antibiotics can't get through that biofilm.
Bacteria?
Yeah, the bacteria, yeah. So they create a sort of sludge and hide, and the antibiotics come along and they can't get through that sludge and get to the bacteria. So this is this bacterial biofilm, and what betulinic acid does is it helps to break that biofilm up, so it actually exposes those bacteria and makes them a bit more vulnerable to taking antibiotics.
Wow, that's really interesting. And then what grows on the bark of birch trees often is chaga.
Chaga, absolutely. And the other medicinal mushroom that you get growing on birch is the Birch Polypore as well. Chaga is a lot rarer than the polypore, and it's like the mushroom forager's gold. It's the one that you want to find because it is a much rarer mushroom, and probably has a much wider spectrum of medicinal properties as well. It's incredibly antioxidant, so anti-inflammatory. It does have that wonderful antibiotic effect to it, so it's very rich in that betulinic acid that I was talking about. There's a lot of research, again, looking at chaga for the immune system, particularly for cancer. Certain lines of brain tumour cells they're finding can be very vulnerable to, I think vulnerable is not quite the right word, they're very sensitive to chaga. And so again, we're looking at lots of really good scientific evidence there for using it. It's quite an interesting mushroom because a lot of people think they've found chaga, and what they've actually found is burrs that grow on birch trees. So
yes, I've seen those, yeah.
Yeah, so birch is like a big conch that grows on the tree, but you can almost see, it almost looks a bit hairy because you can see little branches coming out of there, whereas chaga looks like burnt charcoal. And once you've seen chaga, you will always recognise it again. It's a very slow growing mushroom, and it will tend to grow in birch that are in really exposed areas. So you'll find it much more in the Northern Hemisphere. And of course you find more birch in the Northern Hemisphere as well. But you'll find it on birch that's been really exposed to sort of cold, damp climate, sort of Scottish climate basically. And the further north you go, the more chance that you've got of finding it.
But it is rare, and it is really one of those mushrooms that we should be very careful about when we're harvesting it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you have to assume that if you take chaga from a tree, that mushroom might not grow again on that tree. So I think you've got to be really careful when you're harvesting it, really respectful of how you use it as well, because, you know, it is reasonably rare. And I think you should use it in conditions where you need chaga rather than just sort of taking it as a, you know, one of these sort of, I don't know, you see all these chaga coffees on the market, etc. What's the word I'm looking for there? Functional food. Yeah, there's a lot of functional food out there that you know, looks at mushrooms. And, you know, I don't have an issue with somebody having a functional food with a mushroom in it that's grown on a substrate in a lab if it's going to give you the medicinal compounds. But with chaga, you should be saving it for those conditions that you really need it. And also not using one that's just been grown on a substrate in a lab, because it's just not going to work. I
was going to say to you, you need to be very careful about what you're buying with chaga, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. You want to get something that's sustainably wild harvested. As I say, there are mushrooms that are grown in labs. You know, I use medicinal mushrooms in clinic that have been grown on substrate in a lab condition. So red reishi, for example, they can glean all those medicinal compounds doing it in that way. But the whole thing behind chaga is that betulinic acid that's in that tree. And if you don't get one that's grown on birch, you're not going to get all those magical compounds that give you that amazing medicine. So really, really important when it comes to mushrooms that you get them from a really good source, sustainably harvested, and particularly with chaga, it needs to be from the wild.
Yeah, I once was in a shop and there was an organic chaga for sale. Mm-hmm. Which didn't seem quite right to me. And it was also a completely different colour, because chaga you need to see that brick red colour, don't you?
Well, it's like it's black on the outside, and it's like it's not quite gold, but it's a sort of golden colour inside. Yeah.
And this particular chaga was a kind of a dull colour, and I thought they'd mislabelled it. I thought they'd labelled it, you know, reishi or something else as chaga, but no, it was apparently anorganic chaga grown on substrate. And I said, well, then that's not...
It's not chaga.
It's not chaga.
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, when it comes to organic, you know, you can get something certified organic that's been grown hydroponically. It doesn't actually mean it's been grown in healthy soil. So I think we always need to be very discernible when we're buying stuff, whether it's food or medicine. Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to get back to the mushrooms that you talked about before, because you mentioned the Birch Polypore. Now, that was one of the mushrooms that was found with the Ice Age man, wasn't it?
Yeah, Oti, the Ice Age man, had Birch Polypore on a string around his neck, and he had several different medicinal herbs in his pouch as well. I can't quite remember all the herbs that he had, but he certainly had the Birch Polypore with him. And Birch Polypore is really interesting because it is incredibly antiseptic. I think they think it might be antiparasitic. and I think he may have had some parasites, and they think he might have also had Lyme disease.
Oh yes, I remember reading that.
Yeah. And of course, that betulinic acid in there is going to be quite effective in Lyme, or it would be something that could be used as part of a Lyme protocol. But it's interesting because it's antiseptic, but it's also incredibly healing. So it's like a sticking plaster. So if you ever get a fresh Birch Polypore and slice it, and you had a cut on your hand and put it on, you could stick it on and use it like a plaster. So it's like nature's primitive elastoplast. So I don't know whether he was using it for that or, another medicinal properties, but he was, certainly carrying birch on his person.
And it's brilliant, isn't it, that comes down through the ages, and that it's almost like, you're a medical herbalist and you know about all this stuff, but a lot of us who've been brought up in the National Health Service era have lost touch with all these incredibly useful medicinal properties of the world around us. And also another mushroom that you talked about, the fly agaric, that has been important throughout history almost.
Yeah, there's a massive amount of folklore associated with fly agaric. I think it's quite interesting you're talking about people losing touch. It's when I say to people that my hobby is mushroom foraging, they'll often say, "Oh, I wouldn't know what to pick," and people are really scared of mushrooms, and really, really scared of them. And actually, a lot of the mushrooms are really easy to ID if you do the legwork. You have to, do the legwork, do a bit of background on it, etc. Probably everyone would know the fly agaric because it is the one that we see everywhere. I think everyone would know how to identify it. Red mushroom, white spots. We see it on Christmas decorations, we see it in fairy tales, etc. And that is because it has a very ancient tradition that goes way, way back, steeped through all our history and folklore. So yeah, it's one that I think we can all identify with.
And does that have medicinal properties? I remember being told, "Oh, don't go anywhere near that mushroom because it's poisonous."
Yeah, a lot of people say that you shouldn't touch mushrooms and they'll make you ill, but you can touch mushrooms. You just don't want to be handling mushrooms and then sticking your fingers in your mouth afterwards. But you're not going to come to any harm actually touching a mushroom if you're out in the wilds. Fly agaric is interesting because you could consider it to be toxic, but the compounds that make it toxic also make it very medicinal at the same time. It has a constituent called muscimol, which is hallucinogenic, but it's also a very good painkiller as well. And actually,
a bit like morphine then.
Yeah, it could be a bit like morphine.
Yeah.
If you start looking at the history of our sort of folklore festivals, so Christmas or Halloween, etc. Fly agaric's associated with both of those. What do witches do on Halloween? They fly on their broomsticks. And what does Rudolph do at Christmas? He flies through the sky to bring you your presents, and he's got a red nose. So there's associations with those two festivities and fly agaric, because it's thought that the flying on the broomsticks comes from using fly agaric and having a hallucinogenic trip, and that's how the witches flew. And likewise with Rudolph, the shamans in the northern hemisphere would get reindeer to drink to eat fly agaric, and then they would drink the reindeer urine, because the reindeer would actually purify the mushroom, and by drinking the reindeer urine they'd get some of the hallucinogenic compounds but none of the toxic compounds. So that's where those two associations come with that particular mushroom.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And whoever worked that out, that you could drink reindeer urine?
Well, I went to a medicinal mushroom conference a few years ago, and people were talking about using fly agaric mushrooms, and there was one person that was talking about working with shamans with fly agaric, and there were quite a few interesting characters at that conference, I have to say. And one of the things that came up was the experiences that people have when they've actually used fly agaric as a hallucinogenic. And the experience that they have with it is that they become all-knowing. And I sort of feel like maybe when people have used it, they've almost, perhaps using the mushroom has actually given them the insight to what the mushroom actually does.
Maybe.
And that maybe sounds a bit chicken and egg, but to me it almost sounds like when they take fly agaric, they plug into the matrix.
Maybe.
and they really understand so much, and they're plugging into that mycelial network that, you know, is massive. You know, that's the thing about mushrooms, is that this massive network communication under the surface.
Yeah, because we have to remember the mushrooms themselves are just the fruiting bodies.
Yeah, they're just the fruiting bodies, yeah. So that's what people have described from using fly agaric. And, you know, it's quite controversial talking about using hallucinogenic mushrooms. You know, we've now got the Psychoactive Substances Act, which now means that if you're caught carrying even a fresh hallucinogenic mushroom, you could be breaking the law. But there are, again, lots of really interesting research programs going into using mushrooms medicinally. And it's the psychoactive ones. It's your sort of common magic mushroom in particular. I think they're looking at using it for depression and getting good results. They were talking about, at this conference in particular, about using hallucinogenic mushrooms for post-traumatic stress disorder and getting some very good results there as well. So I think these psychoactives used in a very safe environment have got potential to be really good medicine for people. I'm not encouraging people to go out there and willy-nilly go and consume mushrooms. You know, you have to be really, really careful.
Yeah.
But I think there's some interesting research to be done here to see where we can go with them.
It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, we can't say, we're not saying go and pick some fly agaric and eat it and have a trip.
Absolutely not.
But it is interesting that there is that side to all of those. And I noticed that, you know, in autumn time when you're going for a walk, often the fly agarics are the ones that have been kicked over because people are kind of slightly scared of them. Mm-hmm. But it's so wonderful to know that there are compounds within them that are so beneficial to us.
Yeah, the other compound, the other aspect to fly agaric, as well as its psychoactive aspect, is the fact that we talked about before, is that it's actually a painkiller, and again, it is something that has been used with great success by a number of people for particularly treating sciatica, and using tinctures of fly agaric. So you have to extract it in an alcohol solution, and then by applying a drop or two of tincture onto the nerve root that's causing the sciatica, there's been fantastic results for some people where they've used one application and got rid of their sciatica, full stop.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, again, because this Psychoactive Substances Act, I think, was altered back in 2016, and I think because of all the legal highs that were going on, they really tightened it up. And I think there were a lot of people starting to explore using fly agaric for that particular medicinal purpose, not going on a trip, but using it particularly for managing pain and sciatica and getting very good results. But this act has, I think, really scared a lot of people off from doing that. And I think it's a real shame, because I think that we need to be looking at that potentially in research. I wonder whether we've thrown the baby out in bathwater in that case, because if fly agaric can work that effectively as a painkiller, then that is something that we should be harnessing, not through alternative medicine in any way. That should be something that's coming into mainstream medicine, because if we have a drug that is that effective from a very small one-off application and is giving people that sort of response to a really chronic painful condition, then that is something that we should be accessing and making available to people. But perhaps because it's a natural compound, you know, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, it is interesting though, because we have done that with other substances before. Mm-hmm. I mentioned morphine. Mm-hmm. You know, that comes from a natural source. And we've done that with aspirin, mm-hmm. which comes from a natural source.
But that's extracting one active constituent from the plant, whereas maybe, and I don't know if they need to look at the whole fly agaric or whether they could extract one chemical and do it. And the problem with any of these things is you start extracting one chemical out, you get a stronger, more precise drug, but you're more likely to get side effects from it. And that's one thing that seemed to have happened with the fly agaric using it medicinally for sciatica, was that people were using it and not getting side effects. But would we start to get side effects if we start tinkering with nature? That's always the issue there.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting. And for my own part, I always say stick to the natural, you know, the most natural way possible. Yeah. Because nature's very clever, because all the other compounds that you need with it are there.
It balances it out, and we find that time and time again in the natural world, that you will, and particularly in herbal medicine, we see that you get the action that you want, and it maybe isn't just as potent as conventional medicine or as fast acting, although In my experience, often it is, but we tend to find that we don't get the same sort of side effects with the medicines that we prescribe, the less cumulative damaging side effects. It's much more buffered in its natural form. Yeah.
Yeah, and yes, nature is best. Mother Nature knows best. Keren, that's fascinating. So when we're thinking about Halloween and Christmas as we go forward, we can think about the fly agaric and what that means, and Rudolph, and also think about the health properties of all of these things, and the birch tree as well. Didn't you say once that witches used to fly on birch broomsticks? Was that not?
Yeah, that's what I wondered about. If they fly on birch broomsticks and they use the fly agaric to fuel the flight as such. Yeah,
it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
All these things that come up in our folklore, and they're actually based on something which is helpful, real.
Potentially. Yeah, it's real, and it's that mushroom's got a real potential to be of benefit to a lot of people. So I think a mushroom not to be feared, but one to be respected, because it is steeped so much in our tradition. Here, right across Europe and in the Slavic countries, and there are some people that will actually eat fly agaric mushroom. Now that you can process it, so you can actually remove any of the hallucinogenic compounds, and then it's meant to be quite good for eating. I've not tried eating it myself, and I've certainly never taken it for any sort of pleasure trip as such, but I do believe that there are ways that you can process it and then eat it, and it is meant to be very good. I've also heard from someone that they think that the further east you go, the weaker the hallucinogenic compounds are, and I don't know if there's any truth in that at all, but certainly I think here our fly agaric may be much stronger than you tend to get in Eastern Europe. So it could be that they do consume it more readily across there than we would here. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Well, absolutely fascinating, Keren. Thank you very, very much for coming on the show. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where do they go? What's your website address? You've got a YouTube channel as well with some videos on there.
Yeah, so the website is www.healthfoodandmore.co.uk, and through that you should be able to get links through to all our social media and to the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel doesn't have much on it about mushrooms yet, but that's going to be coming on board. But we have lots of videos up there about lots of the common plants that we have and how you might use them for your health.
Fantastic. And if anybody wants to contact you, all the contact details are on the website.
Absolutely, yeah.
Keren, I hope that you'll come back and talk more about the wonderful world of natural medicine, and I look forward to that.
Great, absolutely. I really look forward to coming and sharing some more knowledge.